mes más o menos estoy escuchando casi todos los días a Ted Lucas.
It is so nice to get stoned and take a load off of my weary mind.
Lo descubrí hace poquito y encontré que este sello, Tearman Records, reeditó en febrero de este año, hace poco, su único álbum solista.
Nice to lay down.
Un álbum que en su momento, allá por 1975, hace 50 años, editó el propio Ted Lucas con la platilla de su bolsillo. Y desde aquel momento el álbum permaneció como un tesoro oculto hasta que salió a la superficie por el año 2010, descubierto, por así decirlo, por el dueño de Yoga Records, que hizo una reedición en vinilo, lo revivió y lo puso en circulación.
It is so nice to get stoned.
Con Jason, el productor de este programa, estuvimos hablando con Mike Dutkewych, que es coleccionista e historiador de la música de Detroit, que es la ciudad en donde vivió Ted Lucas. Mike participó de todas las reediciones del álbum, haciendo trabajo de investigación, escribiendo las notas que acompañan al disco. Le preguntamos primero cómo entró en contacto con la música de Ted.
It was probably around 2008. I actually wasn't familiar with Ted's music when I was asked to participate in the project. That was all just kind of a right place, right time kind of thing. One of my good friends was living with a guy named Douglas McGowan. He runs Yoga Records, and he was kind of the guy, very prominent record collector, dude out in LA who was into really cool stuff and had discovered this Ted record, this Ted Lucas LP. And at that time, I don't think it was on too many people's radars. And he had connected with the family, worked out a licensing deal with the Lucas family, but he was in LA. They were in Detroit, and I just happened to be like the one person that was 1 degree away from him, and involved in music. So basically, he asked me if I wanted to help him collect some tapes, some reel-to-reel tapes that Ted's son Peter still had, and kind of help him start to inventory that stuff. And at that time, I was into records, but Ted was not on my radar, and it is kind of surreal to think about how much that one phone call just sort of, charted out the next almost 20 years of my life.
The Spike Drivers, yeah!
Strange, mysterious sound makes my head spin round and round. I'm losing my mind. I'm losing my mind.
Cuando me puse a revolver un poco en todo lo que había hecho Ted Lucas, me encantaron sus primeras bandas. Con Spike Drivers, por ejemplo, salieron de gira por la costa este, abrieron conciertos para artistas como Eric Burdon and the Animals o Del Shannon. Le preguntamos a Mike sobre ese periodo en la carrera de Ted.
So Ted, around the time that he was attending Wayne State University in Detroit, he was getting plugged into the coffee house folk scene, and he met some like-minded people in town who we're also kind of in that world, but we're looking for things that were maybe a little bit more outside of the Flight kind of coffee house folk scene setting that they found themselves in. You know, LSD might have been involved, and they started to develop kind of a folk rock group, a thing that, you know, a genre that eventually, you know, a couple years down the line in the 60s became a little more well established in scenes like in San Francisco and Austin, but at the time they were kind of the first psychedelic band in Detroit, and that was the Spike Drivers. So they were writing original songs and, you know, experimenting with all sorts of you know, different Eastern instruments and you know, influences from, you know, various world music that they had been exposed to as they were all, you know, children of immigrant parents and whatnot. And they started to kind of infuse that, you know, into, you know, the music that they were writing that was kind of folk-based, but also heavily influenced by blues and rock and roll and other things going on in that early 60s period. So that was the Spike Drivers. They did go to New York and find a little bit of success, you know, getting a professional manager and auditioning for Atlantic Records, and eventually landing a record deal with Warner Brothers. They released 2 singles on Reprise, neither of which really did anything commercially, and eventually that band kind of imploded, at which point Ted and Dick Keelan, who was also in the Spike Drivers, they started their own offshoot project called the Misty Wizards. They remained with Warner Brothers, released 1 single, similarly did not do much commercially, and eventually Ted found himself back in Detroit, dropped from the record deal, and a solo artist for all intents and purposes.
Sometimes I think it's better busting rocks. At least you know where you stand. Just give me one day back on the blocks. What you say about Saturday? Because it's nothing but.
But so, you know, when did the sort of when did the more exotic string instruments start to come into the picture? Was that something that was a feature of these earlier groups, or did he start to get more into the sitar and things like that as he moved into the solo arena?
So that was definitely something that he was experimenting with going back to the Spike Drivers. You know, he had a little bit of experience playing sitar, but it was only once the Misty Wizards came back to Detroit from New York, and they had an opportunity to go out to California and study with Ravi Shankar, which Dick Keelan and Ted Lucas both did. And that was really the point where he took it to the next level, really became committed to mastering the instrument, and it started to really take hold in all of the different types of guitar work and things that he would do. So by the time he was back in Detroit and he was performing as a solo artist, he was also performing as a session player at Motown, which you know, was a very different setting for him, but a place where he could go in and provide something that was very unique and something that only he could have really offered, at least in Detroit at that time. And I think a lot of that did have to do with you know, him immersing himself into those Eastern sounds and really dedicating himself to learning, you know, under Ravi Shankar, and then later, you know, just through his own, you know, kind of obsession with it.
Oriental trajo consigo también intereses por la espiritualidad y la filosofía orientales.
Probably. You know, the thing that's interesting about Ted is he was, the more that I go through, you know, his various tapes that he left behind, you know, the writings that he had, just correspondence with other people, he was kind of everywhere at once, into everything all at once. Like, I definitely think that he had a huge appetite for things that interested him. You know, he wouldn't do anything halfway. And so, yeah, I think, you know, without ever knowing the man or being able to ask him myself, I think that it's fair to assume that, you know, some of the other cultural influences that would come along with the music from those regions probably entered into his world and his worldview. But he was also someone who just as quickly might take a left turn and go hard the other way. So, hard to say.
Then love took a new trip, a blue trip, and you trip away.
Es interesante cómo Ted, en su álbum solista, mantiene su esencia y estilo de cantautor al mismo tiempo en el que estudia y se sumerge en los drones y ragas y la música clásica de la India.
The thing that some people struggle with upon hearing that record for the first time is you go through side A, which is just the most perfect, beautiful folk music, these really nice melodic folk songs, and then side B is a real departure from that in its own really amazing kind of landscape that he creates. But it's, some people maybe want to hear side B as a continuation of those first songs that captivated them, but they have to get used to Tedland, as I call it, which you know, sometimes, like I said, you can take a hard left turn out of nowhere with some of this stuff. And the more time I spent getting to know him through, you know, all of the massive library that he left behind, the more it made perfect sense that, of course, you know, the B-side of that record would be a total departure.
Fines de los 60 y principios de los 70, Ted forma una familia en Detroit, vive con su esposa y sus 2 hijos. Para pagar las cuentas obtiene un trabajo como músico de estudio en Motown Records, termina participando en grabaciones de artistas como The Supremes o Stevie Wonder, mientras a su vez trabaja en su disco solista.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the thing that we have to remember about Ted is he never worked an honest job in his life. Not ever did he want to go punch the clock for anyone and anywhere. And he was so committed to finding a way, using his talents to, you know, make ends meet and, like, you know, start a family, support a family, and do some of these more traditional things. But he had to find ways to do them, very untraditional ways to do them, so that he could stay true to himself and, you know, not have to go work, you know, on the line at Ford like a lot of people that were also playing music alongside him. So when an opportunity like going to record at Motown presented itself to him, yeah, he you know, ran at it full force. And you know, by being sometimes the most talented guy in the room and also being so, like, committed to this direction of music, art only, this is the only way I will make a life for myself, he was able to, you know, make some pretty exciting things happen. So yeah, you do hear him playing on a Marvin Gaye 45, you do hear him on Masterpiece, the LP by the Temptations. Those things happen because Ted willed them to happen, I believe. And, you know, he was also at that same time playing lots of shows at local colleges because he knew that colleges had a budget to pay him more than maybe the coffee shop down the street did. So he, at the same time as being so, like, intensely artistic about everything that he did, he also was savvy enough to know, I should get this residency over here, you know, at Oakland University, because they got $1,000 for me, and that's going to allow me to, you know, pay rent for a couple more months here. So he was doing that. He was doing some local commercial scores and things. Like car dealership needs a rock tune for their 30-minute spot that's going to air on, channel 62. We found lots of tapes that were, recordings like that. So, he was very much an artist, but he was also very much a hustler.
¿Y qué pasó con su álbum solista? ¿No estuvo a punto de ser editado por Warner Bros? ¿Por qué no tuvo difusión? ¿Por qué no tuvo éxito?
Well, both of his bands had worked with Warner Brothers in the 60s, so he had relationships there. And also, I think there was an understanding that in both of those groups, Ted was the talent. Ted was the vision. Not to say anything, like the other players were played very important roles in their own rights, but Ted was really the focal point of both of those groups. And I think whether it was Warner Brothers that reached out to him, or whether he started, pulling on the sleeves of some of the folks that he had met in the industry previously to say, hey, I have this music, would you like to take a listen? I'm not exactly sure, but I do know after going through all of these tapes, you start to see on these, these reel-to-reel boxes, WB demo, stickers that, indicate that he's putting together, 4 or 5 song demo tape for Mo Austin, who was the president of the label at the time. So through that, and also through reading some correspondence that he was writing to friends in the industry, disc jockeys like his friend Larry Miller, who was out in California at that time, he's really trying to solicit advice from people. He's trying to get feedback from people, and he became it seemed like he started to kind of overthink the opportunity a little bit, because going through these tapes, a lot of them are dated 1970, 1971 into 72, but we know that it wasn't until 1975 that the album actually came out. So the question of what happened in between those early 70s demos where things were so hopeful and it seemed like this might be the big break he's been chasing, to 1975 when ultimately he has to self-release the thing. Some kind of breakdown happened in that period, and it became pretty clear that Mo Austin either outright rejected the demo or, just kind of gave him notes that he didn't like and didn't want to compromise on. Because I started to see lots of writing about Mo Austin as a toad. That was one of Ted's favorite lines. So I think there was some falling out that occurred. But the fact that it did take several more years until the album actually came to fruition, I think that's the real tragedy of it, because it's a perfect album, and it's if it were released in the context of those early 70s days when singer-songwriter music was still very commercial, I think it's a different conversation we're having. Instead, it was the mid-70s, and people are buying Thin Lizzy albums and not James Taylor albums, and unfortunately we have this beautiful, quiet folk record come out that isn't commercially what people are looking for necessarily at that time. So I mentioned this in the liner notes. One of the folks I interviewed said it really nicely. They said the difference from 1972 to 1975 was the same as like the difference between 1940 and 1960 in terms of how popular music had shifted so drastically. So unfortunately, by the time the album did come out, it sort of never stood a chance.
Otra cosa interesante sobre este álbum tan particular es que el arte de tapa fue creado originalmente para un álbum de Jimi Hendrix por el artista Stanley Mouse, famoso por sus pósters para conciertos de rock psicodélico durante la década de los 60.
So, Ted and Stanley Mouse go back to probably even before the Spike Drivers days in Detroit, probably 63, 64, they became acquainted. And they were good friends. And Stanley lived in Detroit for a long time, eventually made the move out to California and became, obviously the prominent poster artist and rock and roll artist that he became. But he and Ted stayed in touch, and I'll never forget, early on when I started working on this project, I started kind of calling around to folks and trying to connect dots with people, interview the people that were still around that knew Ted. And one of the people I knew I would love to talk to, but seemed like a bit of a long shot, was Stanley Mouse. So I just sent a random, email to, through his website, just kind of explaining the project and seeing if he was willing to discuss his late friend Ted Lucas. And weeks go by. I'm working, I was working at a record store at the time, and I'm standing in there, helping customers, and my phone goes off. I take the call, and it's, this really quiet, reserved voice on the other end saying, "Hi, Mike, it's Stanley Mouse." So immediately abandon the store, go outside and talk to him. And he shared very candidly, what ended up happening to get that image on Ted's cover of his LP, and how he felt, a lot of regret around that. So the story goes that he had been commissioned by Jimi Hendrix to do the artwork for a record that ultimately didn't come out because Hendrix died. So that artwork was, without a home. Ted was aware of it, and I think he saw an opportunity to attach something that had, according to Stanley, a lot of cachet already just because of its association with the Lost Hendrix album. It seemed like Ted wanted to take that and, get a little juice out of it for himself. And because, their personalities couldn't be any more different, Stanley very meek and reserved, Ted definitely, a little bit of a strong-arming person, eventually wears him down. Stanley agrees to adjust the title across the top to read Ted Lucas instead of Jimi Hendrix, and Ted uses it. But as I mentioned in the liner notes, I think the thing that is most fitting is the final chapter of that particular part of the story, which is that scarab design. Most people have seen a variation of, because by 1978, after Ted's album ultimately failed to do anything, Stanley licensed that artwork to Journey, who then go on to have just, they're one of the biggest stadium rock bands to ever exist. And for decades, they used some type of scarab on their artwork. So, the artwork ultimately got a lot more mileage than the music did on Ted's album, unfortunately for Ted.
Nobody loves me like my baby does. Nobody loves me like my baby does. It's all right, all right, all right.
Y bueno, después de haber terminado su álbum, la gran pregunta es, ¿qué carajo hizo Ted? Porque dentro de lo que se puede leer en internet, no hay rastros de nada que haya hecho hasta el momento de su muerte en el año 1992. Pasó mucho tiempo.
Right. So, music was always a part of the story. It just became increasingly more difficult for him to do the hustling that he had lived off of in the 60s and early 70s. And I think that was probably true for a lot of working musicians at that time. original music was no longer something that people were coming out and paying money to see if it wasn't happening like in a big theater or something. So kind of the emergence of the bar band and cover bands, and that being really the only way to make a dime as a musician, that eventually is the direction Ted had to go. So the album comes out, it really doesn't materialize the way that he hopes it does, and around the same time he starts to have some trouble at home. He's going through a divorce. A lot of things seem to be coming undone, and he's also getting older. And I think that, if you look at photos of him from this late 70s period, you notice that he's starting to dress a little more glam. He's wearing makeup sometimes. He's got the shirt open and, the hair. It didn't quite fit the Ted of the early 70s. It definitely seemed like a bit of an attempt to just kind of throw everything in the wall and see what sticks. He was performing, like I said, in cover bands, but he was calling them, for example, the Atomic Spike Drivers, attempting to cash in on any type of name recognition that his group might have had from 10 years earlier. And but people that showed up to the show, they weren't going to hear the psychedelic rock stuff that the Spikes did in the 60s. They would hear contemporary cover songs. And then in the later 70s, 78, 79, he started trying to do what he called soft rock and reggae rock, which probably not surprisingly didn't do anything. So the interesting part of that, though, is during all of this, he was still writing original music. He was still, committed to trying to, make it as Ted Lucas and not just, a cover artist. And so he recorded a second album, or a lot of a second album. We're still trying to sort out if the thing was ever really completed. But there are 5, 6, 7 songs from a second album that were cut in the studio, and they are a great departure from the Ohm album. They are very electric guitar based. It seemed like he was trying to go straight at the rock thing, but they still maintain, that sense of melody and, the sort of interesting arrangements that Ted had always put into his music, going all the way back to the folk and psychedelic stuff. So it's very much a Ted album, but it's very much a departure from the Ohm album. But that was his last attempt, really, to hit it in, create some kind of hit in the music biz. Whatever, we're still trying to sort out what happened with that second album. But the fact is, by 1980, his marriage had dissolved. He had moved back in with his parents, and that's sort of his lost decade. He spent that entire decade living at home, and only a couple of people that were friends with him even were able to stay in touch with him throughout that period. And one of whom, the drummer from the Horny Toads, which was one of his groups, went to visit him at his parents' house in the 80s, and the thing he told me that he was most struck by was the fact that Ted had recreated his bedroom at his parents' house in the fashion of like the attic studio that he had at his home with his family, where he had all his music gear and, different posters and things, and it was almost as if he had just created like a movie set or something of, the time when Ted was really succeeding with music, and seeing him manifest something like that, but in the basement of his parents' house, was just especially depressing. And unfortunately, that was kind of the last that most people heard from Ted before he passed in '92.
Tell me, good people, what do you want to know? Tell me,
encontré una entrevista a Ted Lucas en un programa de radio de Detroit, en donde estuvo conversando una noche del año 1974. Para que puedan acceder directamente al mismo archivo de audio que encontré yo, les dejo este QR con el enlace. Les recomiendo también el podcast de Mike sobre música olvidada de Detroit de los años 50, 60 y 70. Lo pueden encontrar acá. Los hijos de Ted tienen esta página web donde se puede comprar el vinilo y encontrar algunas otras cosas interesantes. En el año 2021 el sello Perpetual Doom editó un álbum tributo a Ted Lucas con versiones de sus canciones por artistas como John Andrews, que lo hemos tenido de invitado acá en nuestro programa. Lo pueden encontrar en el Bandcamp del sello. Este show es producido por Wastoid. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Hasta la próxima. It's a plain and sane and simple melody. Means the same to you, means the same to me. It's a plain and sane and simple melody. Brings a song to you, brings some joy to me. It's a plain and sane and simple melody. Means the same to you, means the same.